Decelerating during arrival. Typically, you will succeed in following the calculated descent path in VNAV. Sometimes the FMC asks for the speed brake. The scratch pad reads drag required if the winds are not as predicted and the ground speed builds up. But in most cases, the FMC planned decelerations are correct and will slow you down so you can configure for the approach. However, this is not the case if you are not flying the track and/or path that the FMC calculates the descent from. A typical situation where you are not flying the track in the FMC is when entering the last 50 miles from the airport, or passing flight level 100. That's where the ATC starts to give you radar vectors, either cutting off some of the arrival route or directing you to the 5-mile base leg of a 10-mile final. You have 3 options once you recognize that you're taking off the FMC route. You can MDR the whole thing by monitoring distance to an on-airport DME or to a point entered in the fixed page. You can modify the FMC route to reflect the predicted remaining track miles seen on the proc page and continue to fly with reference to the VNAV path. Or you can select a point corresponding to the start of the base or final leg and descend with the shortest path in mind. Observe that as soon as you are radar vectored, you should disengage from LNAV and VNAV. If you stay in FMC mode, the descent path is assuming that you are on track. When you are flying radar headings, you should disengage the VNAV feature to prevent undesired descents and not to be misled by the calculated descent path. That being said, you should most definitely use the VNAV and LNAV information to assess your situation. Just don't let the autopilot do it on its own. At 240 knots, the jet travels at 4 miles a minute. From flight level 100, you know from earlier that this speed will result in a 1,700 feet per minute rate of descent, giving you 4.5 minutes to reach the average final approach altitude of 2,500 feet. This means that you need 18 miles to descend before the final approach point. And then you also need additional distance to decelerate and configure for final approach. If you plan to arrive at the final approach point or fix at a speed appropriate for flap 15, you'll be covered for most any situation. You can use the following strategy. Fly 240 knots indicated as long as reasonable. Decelerate to clean speed, which is approximately 200 knots. Maintain 200 knots and deploy flap 5, which will give you a good command of the deceleration when you need it and enable ATC to expedite traffic. You can use 210 or 180 as ATC dictates. Begin the deceleration from 200 knots to flap 5 speed in level flight when glide slope is showing, or when in a continuous descent when 500 feet above the final approach altitude. If you reach flap 5 maneuvering speed, you will be inside flap 15 limit speed. The flight crew training manual states that the medium landing mass the following applies in level flight. Deceleration from 250 knots to 200 knots will take 35 seconds. Traveling at an average speed of 225 knots for 35 seconds equates to 2.2 nautical miles. Additionally, the flight crew training manual suggests that flaps are deployed in the following pace. Flap 0 to flap 1 takes 20 seconds, which equates 1.1 mile. Flap 1 to flap 5, an additional 20 seconds, also equating 1.1 mile. Flap 5 to flap 15 takes 10 seconds, which is around half a mile. Your deceleration distance from 250 to 180 knots is then 4.9 nautical miles, let's make it 5. But remember that it only applies if you are decelerating in level flight. If you are descending the whole time, I suggest you multiply the distance times 3. You can program the FMC to be at the final approach altitude at 250 knots, 5 miles before the final approach point, and thereby securing that you have the deceleration distance available. But since a constant descent is desirable for both noise abatement and economy, you could also consider both options. From flight level 100 to the final approach point with a level segment, you need at least 23 miles. From flight level 100 to the final approach point with a continuous descent, you lead at least 33 miles. Remember that the prog page shows the total distance to go, so you should maybe add the final approach leg to the distances above. You may not wish to decelerate directly to 200 knots, and you may not wish to maintain 200 knots flying with flap 5. Typically, ATC restricts you to 230, 210, or 180 knots during the arrival, and you must of course comply with such instructions. From the assumption that it will take you 5 miles or 15 miles to decelerate from 250 to 180 knots, you can operationalize by approximating 1 mile per 10 knots, times 3 if you are descending. By doing so, you can monitor if the ATC instruction poses a problem for your approach. Example, maintain 210 knots means that you need to start your reduction to final approach speed 3 miles from final approach in level flight and 9 miles before when descending. Remember though that the 5 or 15 rule only applies in the arrival and approach.